So, Patrick Murray, you are the director of the Polling Institute at Monmouth University. You are an esteemed pollster, so you are the best person to talk about these historic midterms, the fallout, the question marks around Donald Trump. What are you going to tell me?
Well, there were some folks who thought a red wave was going to wash over the country this year. That didn't materialize. And the reason why is because democracy was on the agenda this year and democracy won.
So, Patrick, the history of midterms points to first-term presidents losing ground in the midterms. Joe Biden, he was unpopular. His approvals were in the low 40s. But Democrats have fared pretty well. Were you surprised by the results?
In some ways, yes. Because of that history, that Joe Biden's approval rating was only 42%. We just haven't seen a president at that level gain seats or at least prevent the loss of a significant number of seats. The best showing that we saw in an unpopular president was Jimmy Carter back in 1978 when his party, the Democratic Party, lost 18 seats. It looks like Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, is going to lose maybe 8 seats between the Senate and the House altogether. That is the 5th best showing for a president's party in a midterm going back over 100 years in the U.S. That's just incredible when you think about it. That's just a few presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, have had better showings than Joe Biden has.
I think he'd be happy to be alongside the likes of FDR and JFK. I mean, when it came to the polling, ever since 2016, you pollsters have taken quite a bit of a beating. You faced, I guess, in some quarters, an existential crisis, lots of questioning. But am I right in thinking, I think the pollsters, the main ones, they kind of called it right this time, didn't they?
Yeah, some of us did and some of us didn't. And I think the key there is who was paying attention to which pollsters. So there were a number of pollsters, particularly the Republican-leaning pollsters, who have claimed over the past few cycles when us traditional mainstream pollsters, those of us who work for media organizations or university and academic organizations, were too democratic, that they said they had the secret sauce. They figured it out. Well, their secret sauce was basically a kind of a guess of saying, oh, if these voters are more enthusiastic, or if your neighbors are going to vote for the Republican, then that's how we're going to kind of push our polls. And that's what they did. So they were off. They had a red wave coming. Those of us who continue to stick to our guns, make some minor modifications based on what we learned from our mistakes in the past, were right on the money. The problem that we had is that a lot of folks, including the polling aggregators and the prognosticators, were giving a lot of weight to those other polls, and they're the ones who are help pushing this narrative that a red wave was coming when it was never really in the cards that it was going to happen.
Is that just a sign of the times post 2016 that in some quarters amongst pollsters, amongst pundits, they always want to sort of say, oh, well, Trump and his base always surprises us, so we have to sort of factor that in? And could the fact that we've now seen the results this time, do you think that might start to change? And that 2016 might have been just a one-off?
So we have 2016. We also were off on 2020. In 2016, we kind of had a sense of what was going on there. There was a couple of things in terms of our methodology, in terms of we had too many college-educated voters in our demographics. Also, a significant number, small but significant number of Hillary Clinton voters decided not to vote in that election because they thought she had won it. But in 2020, when we had too much of a Democratic mess, we knew, Joe Biden did win. That's what we thought, but he didn't win by as much as we thought he would. And that was because it looked like Trump voters just didn't want to talk to us, whether they were Republican Trump voters or Democratic Trump voters or independent Trump voters. There was a number of them who didn't want to talk to us, and that moved our numbers by about 3 or 4%. And I think coming out of 2020, our theory was, those of us who are kind of in the mainstream, was this is a Trump-specific phenomenon. That's the only kind of explanation that's left, is that if Donald Trump is on the ballot, then we're going to have problems. But if we take Donald Trump, the person, out of the equation, Trump, he can still be an impact, and he certainly was an impact in this election. But as long as his name is not on the ballot, we probably have a better chance of getting an accurate read and getting an accurate sample. And that's exactly what we found this year.
Ahead of the midterms, the polls were close, but the Republicans were still the favoured party. With the Senate evenly divided and only needing a handful of seats in the House, a red wave wouldn't take that much. And yet, here we are. The Democrats managed to turn Pennsylvania's Senate seat red, and they kept their majority.
If the Republicans were predicting a red wave, the Democrat John Fetterman was a big part of last night's surprising blue wall.
I'm not really sure what to say right now. My goodness.
The Republicans did retake the House, and even though there are still races to be called, the party will only have a slim majority, probably in the single digits. Back in 2018 at the last midterms, the Democrats picked up 41 seats to ensure a comfortable win. So I asked Patrick if these midterms were an open goal that the Republicans missed.
Yes, and they missed it simply because they doubled down on Trumpism. If we look at the candidates that really did poorly, they were the Trumpiest candidates, the one who were most aligned with the election deniers and the conspiracy theorists in the swing states. Now, in some cases, the Democrats helped them along because, we have this primary system where you actually run in an election prior to the general election with your own party's voters who go out and vote for you. And so we had some cases where the Democrats were actually funding the Trumpiest person in that primary election, and putting up advertising that basically helped support that candidate. So they got the kind of candidate that they wanted. And we saw that in a couple of cases where there were blowouts, such as the governor of Pennsylvania, where there was a huge blowout because they got the Trumpier candidate rather than the moderate candidate. But doubling down on the election denial and all those things really backfired in a way that there's some things that we actually didn't see exactly what was going to happen in the polls. And I'll give you an example here. So we talk about the issues that were important to Democrats. And on the Republican side, it was pretty easy. It was about the economy, and it was about crime and immigration. And those two were tied together. Immigrants coming over the border, they were illegal, and they're going to commit crimes in your community, and you want to keep them out. Democrats had a wider range of issues that they were interested in: abortion, climate change, gun control, and just democracy itself and election integrity were things that they were concerned about. What we looked at is, well, that makes it harder to motivate your base, because then you've got all these different pockets of voters who are interested in different things. How do you get those messages out? Well, what it turned out is that the Republicans did that favor for the Democrats by hitting on all these election denial things, putting these election deniers up as their standard bearers. They helped kind of motivate the base without the Democratic Party having to go out and spend money to do it. Is that we got a significant number of voters, small but significant number, significant enough to prevent this red wave, that came out and said, I'm voting for democracy, I'm voting for gun control, I'm voting for climate change, even when the Democrats weren't talking about those issues.
Let's go through some of those topics and how they decided these midterms. You mentioned inflation being an issue for Republicans. Obviously, that also affects Democrats. It affects all voters. And, James Carville, Bill Clinton's famous advisor from the 90s, said, when it comes to elections, it's the economy, stupid. Why did inflation not have as big a motivating factor?
It was true that inflation was the one issue that we saw as the top issue among all partisan groups: Republicans, Democrats, and independents. The problem is independent voters are no longer truly independent. There are very few swing voters out there. There are very few voters that you can actually persuade to change their mind. If you dig down in independents and you start asking them questions about key issues, whether it's crime, whether it's immigration, whether it's democracy, abortion, climate change, they're going to have a clear opinion. You can figure out whether they're Democrat or Republican based on those issues. And so it really became about motivation rather than about issues. And it is the case that neither party had a clear answer on what they were going to do about the economy, which really let those other issues rise to the forefront. So if your number one issue was crime, you were worried about immigrants coming across the border, then you were going to vote Republican. But if your number one issue was something like abortion, climate change, all those other things, a wider range of issues that, again, I said we thought was going to be hard for the Democrats to message, but actually played to their favor. It gave the Democrats kind of a wider menu from which voters could choose from and say, I'm going to come out and vote for the Democratic Party this time.
Do you also sort of get a sense that through your polling that there was a sense that voters could, on the one hand say, well, I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden. His approvals, as we said, were in the low 40s. I don't think he's doing a great job. But on the other hand, they could also then say, well, yeah, he might not be doing that great, and I'm really annoyed about inflation, but I can also make an informed decision to vote for a Democrat over a Republican, because I think on some of these issues, I'd rather do that. That they can, the approvals
Yes.
don't match up with the anger over inflation and your ultimate vote.
Yes, we obviously saw that coming out, and that was the key, is that Joe Biden hasn't done everything they want, and in our polling, we found before the election a majority of voters saying that Joe Biden really isn't paying enough attention to the issues that are important to my family, and I wish he'd pay more attention to those. But when we looked at the exit polls coming out of that, Joe Biden obviously won the voters who strongly approved of his performance, who somewhat approved of his performance, and he lost to those who strongly disapproved of his performance. But then there's that other group, somewhat disapprove of his performance, and he won those the Democrats won those voters.
We saw following the overturning of Roe versus Wade in June that in a number of special elections, Democrats did or outperformed what we would expect. And there was a sense that there was this, this newfound enthusiasm going into November. And then very quickly, in the run-up, in the few weeks before the midterms, it very much turned to actually, no, it's not a big deal. When you looked at the polling throughout the last few months, leading up to November, how important was the issue of abortion? Was it always up there?
What I said all along, as we saw abortion kind of rise, and we had a few special elections over the summer where abortion played a major role in helping the Democrat win. I said, abortion is an important issue. It's just not on its own going to turn out as many voters as you think. And I think we saw that play out in New York State. New York is one of the places where there was a red wave. And it was because they allowed crime to become a more dominant issue because they were focused on abortion. If we turn to a different state, the state of Michigan, which is considered a swing state. It's been Democrat in the past. It has a strong labor movement there. But they had abortion actually on the ballot. So that certainly brought people out. But it was the way that the Democratic office holders in Michigan talked about abortion. They talked about it as an economic issue. They tied it into another issue. They talked about it as, having a child is the biggest economic decision that a woman makes in her lifetime. And that played into these economic worries that people had. And so they not only won the governorship by many more points than we thought they would, they actually took control of state legislatures there in Michigan and basically won across the board because they understood that these things needed to be tied together. It wasn't just about abortion. It wasn't just about democracy. It was about these things and the way they all tie together. And that's where Democrats who were successful in putting that together as that issue, as an economic issue, were the ones that did the best on Election Day.
Joe Biden said the other day that because the Democrats won't keep hold of the House, it's going to be very hard to codify Roe versus Wade into law. How big an issue do you think abortion will be going forward in future elections in 2024? Is this just a one-off year where we've seen people get mobilized, or could this be a new issue which could define the next couple of races?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kieran, because part of it is that with the Democrats out of control in the House, there's definitely not going to be a bill that comes through. In fact, there's a potential that there might be an anti-abortion bill, but of course it would never pass in the Senate. But if the Republicans want to keep harping on that bill and trying to push it even when they can't succeed, then that continues to be part of their brand. That will keep the focus of Democratic voters and some of these voters who came out in this election who aren't strong or enthusiastic Democrats, but say this is an issue that if the Republicans do get full control, then I can bet that they will take that right away from me nationwide forever. And that will remain an issue. So it really is up to the Republicans whether they want to keep beating this drum, because it's not working for them if they do.
And you also mentioned how, threats to democracy, that issue was at the heart of these midterms. Was that just on the Democratic side? I mean, because on the Republican side, one might think that they were also concerned about democracy because they're worried about elections being stolen. But was that not a concern for them, or was that something which, again, doesn't actually, as you've said, motivate them to actually get out and vote? It actually turns them off.
Yeah, that didn't seem to be a motivating factor, and that's the the irony of what's going on in the Republican Party when they undermine faith in elections is how do you motivate people to go out and vote? So what they do is focus on crime and immigration. That it's basically the Hun is at your door, and you need to protect yourself because sooner or later you're going to be attacked. That works much better for them. But this is going to continue to be an issue as long as kind of the Trumpist wing of the party continues to be in control. And we're going to see a couple of things that are coming up. For example, the leadership battle for the Republican Party in Congress. There is going to be a challenge to Kevin McCarthy as the speaker from the more Trumpist parts of the party. I don't know how that's going to play out, but as long as they keep having the kind of the voice of the party, that is going to continue to be an issue that's going to play out on the other side, because the concern is that if the Republicans get in control, they're going to control the levers of power for determining elections, and that will continue to be an issue. So I don't think that's gone away.
And, talking about the issues within the Republican Party, and as you've said, they've chosen in a number of elections these unpopular extremist candidates that seem to have put off voters, and that's lost them races. Can you point to one particular Senate race, governor race, which was really, look, in a midterm year for the first-term president, this should have been an open goal for Republicans, and this candidate completely failed?
Certainly Arizona as a whole, but it wasn't just the Senate candidate. It was that you had the Republicans ran a bad slate of tickets for all the statewide races for governor and so forth, and that hurts them.
And also we saw in Arizona, as you say, Carrie Lake, the governor candidate, she lost. Blake Masters, the Senate candidate, he lost, both endorsed by Trump. But actually, down the list, you go to the Arizona state treasurer, a woman called Kimberly Yee, who won, the Republican won the statewide race by 11 points, wasn't endorsed by Trump, and even at one point thought about going for governor and obviously backed out because of the likes of Carrie Lake. And that's an interesting thing, which I think people don't think about a lot, is that idea of split ticketing. That a Republican voter isn't someone who just goes, right, I'm just going to go red all down the line. They go, in Georgia, Brian Kemp, I like him. He did certify Joe Biden's victory in 2020. I'll vote for him, and then actually I'll also vote for the Democrat in the Senate, Raphael Warnock. Was that more at play than ever before in this election, split ticketing?
Particularly when you're looking at folks who are not particularly popular. We've seen this in the past, and before this era of partisan tribalism that we have today, meaning that you would have people who would be able to run on their own personal popularity, so that you could have a popular Democrat running for one office and a popular Republican running for a different office in the same election cycle in a state, and that both of them do really well because people were voting that. Today, it's very unusual to see the kind of ticket splitting that we did. I estimate that probably about 7% of the vote in Georgia were people who voted for the Republican Brian Kemp for governor and the Democrat Raphael Warnock for Senate. And that's a number that we haven't seen in quite a while in these kinds of elections.
If you talk about Trump candidates, I mean, you look at someone like J.D. Vance, who did win his Senate race in Ohio. So he was someone who was endorsed by Trump, who did win a statewide race. Does that show that Trump-backed winners can win? Or is it because Ohio is such now, while it used to be a bellwether state that twice went for Barack Obama, is it now just gone completely the other way and it's deeply red? And is that another story we're seeing? Is that the old swing states that we thought were bellwethers when it came to presidential elections, Ohio, Florida, they are no longer the swing states. We have to look to Arizona, to Georgia, back to Pennsylvania.
The states that are more diverse ethnically and racially are the ones that are becoming the swing states now. That the swing states used to be blue collar, working class white voters, who had been labor union members and had voted Democrat, but now since the Reagan years had switched to Republican, and so they were always up for grabs. That's not the case anymore. Florida is not the case anymore. So we're looking at states like Arizona with a higher Latino population. We're looking at states like Georgia. North Carolina will probably be coming into play more and more over the coming years. Pennsylvania is not as racially diverse as those states, but because it's of the concentration of urban voters and the suburbs around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, that will continue to be in play for quite some time. So that's what we're looking at, is these states where we're having these growing populations being the ones that for at least for the next few cycles will be the ones that we should be paying the most attention to.
And so looking forward to those future election cycles, we now know that Donald Trump is running for president again in 2024. But following the midterms, members of the Republican Party have turned on him.
Those who are most closely aligned with the former president underperformed. Those who are talking about the future, who had managed their states well, they overperformed.
Some argue that he's an election loser. He lost the House in 2018, he lost the presidency and the Senate in 2020, and his candidates failed to achieve a red wave this time round. One big Republican winner of the midterms was Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who won re-election by nearly 20 points.
The people have delivered their verdict. Freedom is here to stay.
He ran on cultural issues like refusing to lock down during COVID and campaigning on what kids are taught in schools. So I asked Patrick if that kind of campaign is just a Florida thing, or whether it can resonate in the rest of the country. And what would that tell us about how DeSantis might frame his own presidential run?
Yeah, I think it tells us a lot about how he might frame a presidential run, and it has a lot of appeal to Republican voters. What we saw in this past election, though, is a rejection from the larger general electorate when you double down on those particular issues. There were a number of voters who were simply tired of that. And thought that was pushing us in the wrong direction, and was just focusing on things that really were kind of undermining stability in our system. So I don't see how that's going to play out well. And again, you can fool yourself into thinking that the tactics that you use to win over a specific geographic and cultural population are going to play out across the country, and that doesn't always play out in that case.
The polling is still early days when it comes to the Republican primaries of 2024. Is that because you think, DeSantis, even though him and Trump aren't friends at the moment, he has still towed a Trumpian line? Is the argument that we should be looking to Mike DeWine, the governor in Ohio, who had a very comfortable re-election, Brian Kemp, who you mentioned in Georgia? Does this mean that there could be an avenue for, an old school, bit more centrist Republican?
I think so, in a general election, certainly. And that's what we saw but that's the problem, is that you've got to get that through this primary system, which is right now controlled by the Trumpian wing of the party. That's who the voters are that come out in those elections.
And have you already started looking at polling and thinking about the Democratic side? Because there is that concern that, Joe Biden now feels emboldened. Does he run again? Is that the right person to run again? He might be able to beat Trump again, but if it's not Trump but DeSantis, would he win?
A lot of polling has started. And one of the things that I've learned from doing this over the years is that whatever we poll at this particular point in time, nearly 2 years out from the next presidential election, will be wrong, because we'll have missed something. So, Joe Biden certainly has a lot to think about himself, about whether he does, feel that he can do a second term and whether he will run. When we look at folks that are in the wings right now, and looking at the tenor of our political environment right now, I think you have to look at a few people and I've already mentioned the governor of Michigan and her run. Her name's Gretchen Whitmer. Her understanding of how to put the different Democratic core issues together with those bread and butter economic issues. And the Democratic Party could do worse than look to somebody like her as their next standard bearer. But again, that's a whole primary system in and of itself. Joe Biden was able to negotiate that back in 2020 because the liberal wing, the progressive wing of the party, kind of split among a number of different candidates, and he kept holding on to that moderate center. But if he decides not to run, it's still not a clear picture about who the Democrats would choose.
Is it right to look at these midterms and say, on the one hand, Trump may have been found out, that 2016, he defied the odds. 2018, he lost the House. 2020, he lost the presidency and the Senate. And now they've had a really bad midterms. Is it that, has Trump finally been found out ahead of 2024? But if he did make it to 2024, is the other thing that we now know is that Joe Biden somehow got the nomination in his third go after failing in 1988 and 2008. That Joe Biden always surprises and always has a comeback. Can you think of it that way? Or even now, as you say, you always get it wrong. 2024 won't necessarily be a rerun of 2020.
One thing I think everybody should have learned is that you don't count Joe Biden out. He's gotten a lot of grief, even recently, when he went out and he gave specific speeches about this election being about protecting democracy. And even folks on the left and the liberal media were calling him out for talking about that. And he was basically right, because I think he activated some of those voters to say, yes, I'm going to come out and make that vote. And that helped the Democrats keep the Senate and just make it a narrow loss on the House. He also has had a significant number of legislative accomplishments that when we just go back and just whether you agree or disagree with them, he's had a lot more legislative accomplishments than a lot of other presidents in their first 2 years, and many presidents in their full terms he's already had. And yet he still doesn't get quite the credit for it. And I think so, whatever happens in 2024, you can't count Joe Biden out. But there's still a lot of unknowns. I mean, what we did see is that there does seem to be a group of voters who are tired of Trumpism. They want to put that behind us. Now, it's a narrow majority right now, but I can't see if he is the standard bearer in 2024 that suddenly that changing, unless Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee is so weakened at that point that people would reconsider Donald Trump. But there seems to be a sense in this country that at least a narrow majority, want to turn the page from Trumpism and try to move back into a government that actually works again.
And so my final question would be, on some of those points is there seems to be this prevailing narrative that democracy won the day, that the election deniers got trounced at the polls. But is there also not a sense that America feels even more divided than it was before? You still have a pretty evenly divided Senate. You now have a House which is, incredibly tight, divided between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans who are still having these debates about how Trumpian they'll be. Is America not more divided than before these elections?
It's as divided. I mean, it was, we've been seeing this split almost down the middle now for the last decade or so, but certainly since Trump came on board and really kind of created this dividing line where you couldn't sit on the fence anymore. You had to pick a side. And when people picked that side, they came down to almost 50-50. And that still exists and will continue to exist until one side or the other kind of gives in and says, hey, we got to go back to the way things were a generation ago when we were willing to compromise and we were willing to say, hey, we might not be able to take the lead in this win, but it's more important to move the country forward on a compromise bill or legislation. We're still a long ways away from being able to do that. But one of the things that we did see in this election, I will say in this election, is it pulled us back from the precipice of really undermining our faith in the system entirely. I mean, that's the direction that we've been going for the last 5 years, is a lack of faith in institutions, a lack of faith in elections. And that the sense that we're going to go over the cliff where we said government doesn't matter anymore, who cares? And we had enough voters who came out and said, you know what, I do care. I want to pull this back. We're still 50-50 on the issues. We're still 50-50 on a lot of things, but at least we've pulled back from the precipice of saying we don't care about maintaining the integrity of our institutions.
Patrick Murray from Monmouth Polling, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Kieran.